In the vast tapestry of the galaxy, where heroes and villains often appear in stark contrast, there exists a figure who defies such simple labels, a man whose story is not one of unshakable light nor utter darkness, but of tragedy born from ideals, pride, and betrayal. And that figure is Count Dooku of Serenno, once one of the most gifted Jedi of his generation, later the infamous leader of the Separatist movement, and finally the Sith Lord known as Darth Tyranus. His life was a winding path of brilliance and sorrow, a tale that began with noble origins and the promise of greatness, but ended with manipulation, isolation, and a death at the hands of the very system he thought he controlled. To speak of Dooku is to speak of contradictions, a Jedi who valued justice, yet turned his back on the Order, a man of refinement who embraced war, a seeker of truth who was seduced by lies, and at every stage of his life, he walked a line between duty and doubt, his choices echoing not only through his own fate, but through the galaxy itself. For without Dooku, there would have been no Clone Wars, no rise of Palpatine's empire, and no crucible in which Anakin Skywalker would be broken. And yet, in the quiet telling of his story, one can see that Dooku was never meant to be merely a villain, for his fall was not born of malice but of disappointment. Not of hatred, but of despair, and in that lies the tragedy of his life. He sought order in a galaxy drowning in corruption. He craved justice in an age where the Senate served greed, and he longed for meaning when the Jedi Order grew blind to the suffering of those they were sworn to protect. Guided first by Yoda and then by his own master, Dooku rose to become a Jedi Master of great renown, training students such as Qui-Gon Jinn, whose independence and compassion reflected the best of what Dooku once believed in. But as the years passed, disillusionment took root, and he found himself estranged from the Council, disheartened by their inaction. Not of hatred, but of despair, and in that lies the tragedy of his life. He sought order in a galaxy drowning in corruption. He craved justice in an age where the Senate served greed, and he longed for meaning when the Jedi Order grew blind to the suffering of those they were sworn to protect. Guided first by Yoda and then by his own master, Dooku rose to become a Jedi Master of great renown, training students such as Qui-Gon Jinn, whose independence and compassion reflected the best of what Dooku once believed in. But as the years passed, disillusionment took root, and he found himself estranged from the Council, disheartened by their inaction, and eventually pulled back to his ancestral home on Serenno, where the call of bloodline and legacy reignited a pride that the Jedi teachings had never fully silenced. It was there, amid noble halls and political intrigue, that he began to drift away from the light, opening his heart to Sidious's whispers, convincing himself that the Sith path was not one of a selfish ambition, but the only way to bring true balance and order to a broken galaxy. But in choosing this path, he sealed his fate, for Sidious never saw him as a partner, only as a pawn. And though Dooku commanded armies and wielded authority, he was always trapped within the design of a master who planned his demise from the beginning. And eventually pulled back to his ancestral home on Serenno, where the call of bloodline and legacy reignited a pride that the Jedi teachings had never fully silenced. It was there, amid noble halls and political intrigue, that he began to drift away from the light, opening his heart to Sidious's whispers, convincing himself that the Sith path was not one of a selfish ambition, but the only way to bring true balance and order to a broken galaxy. But in choosing this path, he sealed his fate, for Sidious never saw him as a partner, only as a pawn. And though Dooku commanded armies and wielded authority, he was always trapped within the design of a master who planned his demise from the beginning. They had for centuries, their wealth and pride shaping not only their families, but the politics of the entire system. And it was into one of these houses, the powerful House of Dooku, that a child was born who would one day become both a savior and a scourge to the galaxy. From the moment of his birth, the Force flowed strongly in him, and though to his family he was simply another heir to their aristocratic line, to those attuned to deeper currents he was something extraordinary, a child destined for greatness. His earliest years were spent amid the grandeur of Serenno's palaces, marble halls filled with echoes of power and privilege, servants tending to every need, tutors introducing him to history, literature, and the arts. And though he was still a child, the air of refinement and authority sank deep into him, shaping his posture, his speech, his very sense of self, giving him the poise that would one day make him one of the most commanding figures in the galaxy. Yet Serenno was not untouched by struggle, for beneath the luxury of the noble houses lay inequality and unrest, the weight of centuries of aristocracy pressing upon the common people, and even as a boy, Dooku sensed the disparity. He watched the farmers laboring in the fields, the guards patrolling the cities, and though he could not yet name it, a part of him felt the tension between privilege and duty, between power and responsibility, a conflict that would haunt him all his life. His family expected him to grow into a leader of Serenno, to uphold their honor and expand their legacy. But fate intervened when Jedi representatives, guided by the Force, arrived to test the young heir. And in him, they discovered potential so rare and so powerful that leaving him untrained was unthinkable. His father, proud and stubborn, resisted the idea of surrendering his son to an order that demanded detachment and humility. For to the Count of Serenno, such notions were an insult to their lineage. But the will of the Jedi and the lure of the boy's potential could not be denied. And so, after much tension and resentment, Dooku was taken from his ancestral home, spirited away to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, to begin a life that would sever him from his family's legacy, but never erase its imprint upon his soul. For though he was raised among Jedi, schooled in their ways, and nurtured by their philosophy, the memory of Serenno, the grandeur, the pride, the sense of belonging to something ancient and noble, remained within him, never extinguished, a whisper that he was not like the other younglings, that he came from a lineage apart. And so, while he grew into one of the temple's most gifted initiates, excelling in lightsaber training, mastering the Force with discipline and precision, there was always a part of him that carried Serenno within, a quiet reminder of the nobility he had been born into and the responsibility he believed it entailed. That duality between Jedi discipline and Serenno pride was the seed of both his greatness and his downfall. For from the very beginning, Dooku was destined to stand apart, to see himself as something more than ordinary, to demand of himself and others a standard that few could ever meet. As the years passed, Serenno itself became a distant but powerful symbol in his mind, the home he had left yet could never truly abandon, the place that tied him to family, to legacy, and to the notion of leadership beyond the narrow walls of the Jedi Temple. And in time, that seed would grow into discontent, into disillusionment, and finally into rebellion. But in those earliest days, it was simply a quiet presence, the first hint that Count Dooku's destiny was not to remain forever within the boundaries of the Jedi, but to walk a path uniquely his own, shaped by both light and shadow, by both the Jedi Temple and the noble halls of Serenno, the world of his birth and the heritage that would one day call him back to claim a mantle he had once forsaken. Though Dooku's departure from Serenno severed him physically from his aristocratic roots, the world of his birth remained etched in his memory, and throughout his years of training he often dreamed of its towering castles, its noble assemblies, and the proud lineage that had shaped him in his earliest days. For while the Jedi encouraged their younglings to release attachment and identity, Serenno's legacy was one that clung to him like an unseen cloak, impossible to shrug off. He would recall the stern figure of his father, Count Gora, who had looked upon him not as a gift, but as a disappointment. For to Gora the Jedi were thieves stealing away an heir, stripping the family of a son who could carry their name forward, and that rejection carved deep scars in Dooku's young heart, teaching him both the sting of abandonment and the allure of proving himself worthy despite those who had cast him aside. His mother, Countess Anya, had shown more softness, but hers was a love restrained by the rigid formality of Serenno's noble traditions. And so when Dooku left, he carried with him not the warmth of familial embrace, but the cold impression of expectation, of legacy unfulfilled. These memories became the foundation of his inattention. Within the Jedi Temple, he was told to let go of the past, yet Serenno lingered in every posture, every elegant turn of phrase, every instinct towards authority, making him distinct among his peers. Admired for his refinement, but also set apart for his quiet arrogance. Serenno itself mirrored these contradictions, for while its noble houses prided themselves on culture, art, and order, their governance also bred inequality, rebellion simmering beneath the gilded surface, and Dooku, even as a child, had sensed the unrest in the eyes of the common folk, the discontent hidden beneath bows and courtesies. This awareness, sharpened later by Jedi philosophy, convinced him that leadership was both privilege and burden, that rulers had a duty to guide with justice rather than greed. And though he tried to align this conviction with the Jedi ideal of service, there remained a seed of discontent within him, a whisper that perhaps only those of noble bearing truly understood the responsibility of guiding the galaxy. His early fascination with history and politics, encouraged by Serenno's tutors before the Jedi ever arrived, grew into a lifelong passion, and as he studied the Republic's endless bureaucracies and the Jedi Council's rigid decisions, he began to see both as flawed, slow, and unworthy of the ideals they claimed to uphold. Serenno's grandeur had taught him to expect excellence, to believe in clarity of vision, and when he looked upon the Senate's corruption or the Order's compromises, he felt the sting of disappointment, as though the galaxy had failed to meet the standard that his upbringing had instilled in him. Thus, the boy who had once walked Serenno's marble halls grew into a man whose every word and gesture carried the weight of nobility, whose pride was tempered by discipline but never erased, and whose path, though entwined with the Jedi, was forever shadowed by the legacy of his origin. For no matter how far he journeyed, how many battles he fought, or how many apprentices he trained, Count Dooku of Serenno remained at his core both Jedi Knight and noble heir, torn between two worlds that would one day collide within him, driving him toward choices that reshaped the destiny of the galaxy itself. When the young heir of Serenno was brought to Coruscant and placed within the walls of the Jedi Temple, he entered a world unlike anything his noble eyes had ever seen. A world of endless marble corridors, soaring towers, and meditation gardens, where the hum of the Force seemed to breathe through every stone. And though he had left behind the grandeur of his family estate, he found here a grandeur of a different kind, a majesty not of lineage or wealth, but of wisdom, discipline, and purpose. Yet even among the younglings, Dooku stood apart, his bearing already refined, his speech crisp, his posture regal, traits that made him admired by some and resented by others. For while the Jedi sought to temper individuality into harmony, he radiated a sense of presence that was difficult to hide. Under the careful eye of the temple instructors, for while the Jedi sought to temper individuality into harmony, he radiated a sense of presence that was difficult to hide. Under the careful eye of the temple instructors, Dooku revealed himself as a prodigy, his affinity for the Force sharper than most, his lightsaber training precise and elegant even in childhood. And though he strove to master humility, pride flickered within him whenever he excelled. For unlike many younglings who stumbled through drills, Dooku moved with the certainty of one who expected perfection from himself and often achieved it. He gravitated toward the archives, poring over history and philosophy with a hunger that outstripped his peers, and there he first encountered tales of great Jedi of the past, warriors, diplomats, seekers of truth, whose legacies inspired him, and yet also seeded in him the conviction that the Jedi of his own day fell short of such greatness, too content with routine, too bound to the whims of the Republic. Among the children he forged friendships, most notably with Sifo Dyas, a fellow youngling who questions that would one day consume them both. But if there was one figure who shaped him above all, it was Grand Master Yoda, who from an early age saw in Dooku both immense promise and dangerous pride, and who guided him with patience, testing his will through riddles, meditations, and sparring, teaching him that the Force was not a tool for dominance, but a current that required surrender. Yoda's lessons left a mark, for Dooku respected him as no other. Yet even as he grew under the Grand Master's watchful eye, he struggled with the contradiction between what he was taught and what he felt. Taught to release pride, yet born into it. Taught to serve, yet raised to lead. Taught to embrace humility, yet carrying within him the unshakable sense that he was destined for greatness. His time as a youngling was filled with triumphs, excelling in lightsaber forms, mastering complex exercises in telekinesis, outshining his peers in the intellectual debates that the instructors encouraged, and even glimpsing flashes of Force insight that made the masters take note. But it was also a time of isolation, for though he was respected, he was rarely embraced. His peers often found him aloof, too formal for play, too serious for jest, and Dooku, though outwardly unbothered, carried within him the loneliness of a boy who had been rejected by his father and never truly felt at home among those who were supposed to be his new family. At night, in the temple dormitories, he would lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering about the world he had left behind, about the halls of Serenno, about the destiny denied to him by being given to the Jedi. And though he strove to meditate those thoughts away, they never truly left him, whispering of heritage, of identity, of something more than the Order allowed. Yet the Jedi Temple was also where he learned discipline, where he honed the self-control that would one day make him one of the greatest duelists in galactic history, where he absorbed the traditions of the Jedi Code, and where he first felt the intoxicating balance of the Force flowing through him like a second heartbeat. It was here, in those formative years, that the contradictions of Dooku's life began to crystallize. The brilliance of a mind that sought truth, the discipline of a warrior destined to master combat, the pride of a noble heir who could never fully release his heritage, and the loneliness of a child never quite belonging in either world. And these contradictions, unaddressed and unresolved, would grow with him, shaping every choice he made, every triumph and every failure, until the boy from Serenno, who shone so brightly among the younglings, would one day walk a darker road, convinced that the galaxy could not be saved by following the narrow path laid before him. As the years of his youngling training stretched onward, Dooku's presence within the Jedi Temple grew ever more pronounced, for though he was still only a boy among many, his brilliance made him impossible to overlook, and with brilliance came both admiration and suspicion. For while instructors marveled at his precision and discipline, his peers often whispered of his aloofness, of the way he carried himself like one already destined for greatness, and though he strove to embody humility, the pride of Serenno glimmered through every word he spoke and every motion of his lightsaber. Yet in these years it was not only his skill with the blade that set him apart, but his mind. For he devoured the scrolls and holocrons in the archives, memorizing histories, philosophies, and treatises with an intensity that astonished even the temple scholars. And often he would sit late into the night with Sifo Dyas at his side, debating the meaning of justice, the failures of the Senate, and the duty of the Jedi to act when corruption spread unchecked. These conversations were harmless in their youth, yet they revealed the seeds of discontent already budding in Dooku's heart, a sense that the galaxy needed more than watchful guardians. It needed leaders with the clarity to act, and he could not help but see himself as such a figure. His friendship with Sifo Dyas gave him comfort, for Sifo's earnest nature softened Dooku's sharp edges, grounding him with laughter and loyalty. Yet even there, Dooku often assumed the role of teacher, guiding, persuading, even commanding, as if the Force itself had marked him as one who should lead. Yoda, ever perceptive, saw these currents with quiet concern, and though he nurtured Dooku with patience and riddles meant to humble him, the youngling often left their sessions frustrated, unable to reconcile the call of serenity with the fire in his heart that demanded action. Still, Dooku excelled in every aspect of training. His control over telekinesis surpassed his classmates. His saber technique already hinted at the elegant style of Makashi he would one day master, and his understanding of Force philosophy ran deeper than his years. But with each success came the whisper of pride, the subtle belief that he was destined to stand above rather than among. He tried at times to immerse himself in the camaraderie of the creche, joining sparring games and lessons, but more often than not he withdrew, preferring solitude or the company of Sifo Dyas, his sense of being apart both self-imposed and quietly reinforced by those who found him too stern, too serious, too noble for childish play. And so, within the marble walls of the Jedi Temple, Dooku began to form the foundations of the man he would become. Brilliant, yet proud, disciplined yet restless, a seeker of justice who questioned the very order that taught him. a child carrying the wound of a father's rejection and the burden of heritage he was told to forget, yet never could. These contradictions shaped his every step, and while the Jedi celebrated him as a prodigy, the Force whispered of paths yet unwritten, paths that would lead him away from the serenity Yoda tried to instill and toward the shadowed destiny that awaited him, a destiny not yet revealed, but already stirring in the restless heart of the youngling who would one day be remembered not as a student of the temple, but as Count Dooku, the lost Jedi whose brilliance and pride would change the galaxy forever. When the time came for Dooku to be chosen as a Padawan, the boy who had once carried himself with the airs of Serenno was taken under the wing of Jedi Master Taim Cerulean, a scholar of the Force and a seasoned diplomat whose wisdom was matched by his patience. And in this pairing, the Council believed they had found a balance that might temper Dooku's brilliance with humility. For Taim was not a warrior first, but a thinker, a man who valued study and reason over the clamor of battle. Yet from the first, it was clear that their bond would be complex, for while Dooku respected his master's intellect, he also bristled at the slow pace of his teaching, eager to prove himself in combat and on missions beyond the temple, while Taim urged reflection, meditation, and caution. Their journeys took them across the Republic, from the glittering spires of Coruscant's upper levels to the impoverished fringes of Outer Rim settlements, where Dooku first confronted the realities of injustice that the Jedi so often sought to contain without fully solving. And in these missions, his passion for order and fairness began to sharpen, for he saw governments mired in corruption, senators bribed by guilds and corporations, and Jedi asked to intervene without the authority to enact lasting change. And it struck him as hypocrisy that an order sworn to peace should serve a republic so broken. In Taim's eyes, these were lessons in patience, that the Jedi could not fix the galaxy through force of will, but must serve as calm guides within a flawed system. But to Dooku, they were lessons in frustration, igniting a hunger for greater power and influence, the belief that the Jedi should act boldly where the Senate faltered. Still, Taim nurtured his Padawan with diligence, refining his already remarkable lightsaber skill, introducing him to the elegant form of Makashi, a duelist's discipline that suited Dooku's natural grace and precision. And though the young apprentice had a tendency toward arrogance, he also possessed a fierce dedication to practice, spending hours perfecting every movement until his blade flowed like a whisper of light through the air. On worlds torn by disputes, Dooku's bearing impressed planetary leaders, his noble poise winning him respect that few apprentices could command. And more than once, Taim watched with quiet pride as his Padawan turned tense negotiations with words as sharp as his saber. Yet beneath the successes ran the same contradictions that had defined him since childhood. The pride that came with every victory, the discontent that swelled whenever compromise seemed weak, the yearning for clarity in a galaxy forever clouded by politics. He sparred often with Sifo Dyas, whose path as a Jedi unfolded alongside his own, their friendship both challenge and comfort. For Sifo's impulsive courage contrasted with Dooku's calculated elegance. And in their debates over the role of the Jedi, each pushed the other toward convictions that would one day lead them both into tragedy. As Taim guided Dooku through the trials of diplomacy, combat, and inner discipline, he recognized in his apprentice both extraordinary promise and a dangerous restlessness. and though he cautioned him to beware the temptations of pride and power, Dooku listened with outward patience but inward certainty that his destiny lay beyond the ordinary bounds of the Jedi, that he was meant not merely to serve but to lead. These years as a Padawan shaped him more than any other, for they honed his talents, deepened his knowledge, and sharpened his vision of what the galaxy should be. Yet they also left unhealed the wounds of rejection and the hunger for control that Serenno had planted in him. And thus the boy who had left his noble home became the Padawan, who carried the pride of Serenno into every duel, every debate, every choice, and who would one day transform that pride into a conviction so powerful that it would tear him from the order and set him on the path to darkness. As Dooku's years under Master Thame Cerulean stretched onward, the lessons of apprenticeship became both the crucible of his growth and the stage for the conflicts that would one day shape his destiny. For while Thame taught with patience and wisdom, always urging calm reflection and the pursuit of balance, Dooku's fiery intellect and noble upbringing often clashed with the restraint expected of a Jedi apprentice, and though he obeyed his master with outward respect, inwardly he often questioned the prudence of waiting, of tempering action with endless caution, believing instead that decisive strength was the key to justice. Their missions across the galaxy only reinforced these feelings, as time and again Dooku saw senators haggling for bribes while their people starved, saw warlords rise because the Republic lacked the will to oppose them swiftly. And while Thame insisted that the Jedi were mediators, not rulers, Dooku quietly nursed the conviction that the Order's passivity was weakness disguised as serenity. Still, he absorbed much from his master. Long hours in the temple archives where Thame introduced him to ancient philosophies and forgotten lore, late-night discussions in quiet meditation chambers about the interplay between light and darkness, and the refinement of his lightsaber technique into the elegant precision of Makashi. The form that became as natural to Dooku as breathing, a reflection of his aristocratic grace and his need for control. Yet each triumph deepened the quiet pride that pulsed within him. Each duel he won against peers confirmed his superiority. Each mission in which his words swayed planetary leaders convinced him he was destined to shape the galaxy. Each glance of admiration from others fed the sense that he was not simply another Padawan, but one who carried greatness in his blood. At times, he and Thame quarreled, their debates sharp but respectful. Thame urging patience, Dooku demanding action, Thame reminding him of humility, Dooku insisting that the Jedi must rise above corruption with strength. And though he loved his master in his own way, admiring the breadth of his knowledge and the constancy of his guidance, he also quietly judged him for being too cautious, too deferential to a council that Dooku was beginning to suspect had lost its clarity. Still, there were moments of true harmony between them, when together they negotiated peace on worlds torn by warlords, when they faced pirates and mercenaries side by side, when Thame's calm steadied Dooku's fire and Dooku's passion pushed Thame to act more decisively. And in those moments, the bond of master and apprentice was strong. But the contradictions in Dooku's heart grew ever sharper, and the memory of Serenno never truly left him. He dreamed of its noble halls, of the weight of lineage that had once been his, and though he tried to banish those thoughts as attachment, they lingered as a reminder that he was different, that he was born not to serve, but to rule. Sifo Dyas remained his closest friend during these years, their debates fierce and their loyalty unshaken, and often they spoke of what the Jedi could be if only the Order dared to act. If only the Council shed its endless compromises, and these conversations, harmless in their youth, began to sow in Dooku the conviction that true leadership required not endless patience, but vision and strength. By the time he neared his trials, Dooku was already regarded as one of the most brilliant apprentices of his generation, a duelist without equal, a negotiator whose eloquence rivaled his blade, and a philosopher whose questions unsettled even the masters. Yet beneath that brilliance lay the flaw that would one day undo him, the belief that he alone could see what others could not, that his perspective was purer, sharper, truer than the collective wisdom of the Jedi, and though Tame urged him again and again to beware the danger of pride, Dooku carried it with him like a crown, an invisible mantle he could neither relinquish nor acknowledge, and thus the Padawan who once entered the temple with all the promise of light now carried within him both the brilliance of a future master and the shadow of a future traitor, his path already bending under the weight of ambition, pride, and disillusionment. When at last Dooku passed his trials and was knighted, the ceremony was both solemn and triumphant, the culmination of years of study, discipline, and conflict, and though he bowed respectfully before the masters, receiving their blessing with grace, inwardly he felt not only relief, but certainty, as though the galaxy itself had acknowledged the destiny he had long known awaited him. No longer a Padawan under the guidance of Tame Cerulean, he stepped forward into the ranks of the Jedi Knights with all the elegance and pride that seemed to emanate naturally from his noble bearing. And with this new title came new responsibilities that carried him far across the galaxy in service of the Republic. His missions were varied: to mediate disputes between feuding houses on core worlds where politics weighed heavier than truth, to defend settlers on distant outer rim colonies threatened by pirates, to lead peacekeeping efforts on war-torn planets whose people cried for order. And in all of these tasks, Dooku shone, his eloquence winning trust in council chambers, his saber flashing with unmatched precision in battlefields, his presence commanding respect from both allies and rivals. It was during these years that his reputation as one of the most refined duelists of his era truly began to grow. For while many Jedi fought with vigor and improvisation, Dooku's mastery of Form 2, Makashi, gave his movements an elegance few could match, each parry precise, each riposte calculated, and opponents who faced him in duels often spoke of the chilling calm in his eyes, the aristocratic poise that seemed to suggest he was always 2 steps ahead. Yet even as he served, the old tension within him remained, the noble blood of Serenno, whispering of responsibility and power, the Jedi Code demanding detachment and humility, and the fractured politics of the Republic feeding his doubts about the very institution the Jedi had sworn to protect. Again and again, Dooku found himself frustrated by the Senate's corruption, watching as senators placed credits and corporate interests above justice, while the Jedi Council counseled patience, caution, and service, even to those who clearly served only themselves. On worlds where famine raged because supply lines had been hoarded by greedy officials, he felt the sting of helplessness. When corporate guilds enslaved workers in violation of the Republic's ideals, and the Council refused to intervene directly, he burned with indignation. And while he carried out his duties faithfully, these moments left him restless, his noble heart convinced that more decisive leadership was needed. He was no ordinary Jedi Knight. His commanding voice, his eloquent manner, Din, and his noble presence made him a figure that leaders listened to, and often he accomplished in words what others would have required force to achieve. But each success also fed the sense that he was singular, that he was meant to lead rather than simply serve. Still, in these years he forged deep bonds, continuing his friendship with Sifo Dyas, who was himself rising within the Jedi, and meeting others such as Jedi Knight Line Costana, whose fascination with prophecy and the mysteries of the Force stirred Dooku's curiosity. About the darker, forgotten truths that the Council often dismissed. It was during his knighthood that Dooku began to quietly explore areas of Jedi history that others avoided, studying the fall of past Jedi, the rise of the Sith, and the fragility of balance. And though he did not yet stray into forbidden practices, these studies planted questions that would one day pull him further from the light. But for all his doubts, he was admired in the Order, a knight of honor and skill, a teacher to Padawans in training, a figure who inspired those around him, and there were whispers even then that he might one day sit on the Council. Yet Dooku himself often felt a gnawing dissatisfaction, as though the Order's endless cycle of missions, mediation, and restraint kept him from addressing the deeper wounds of the galaxy. And in this frustration, the boy from Serenno, who had once dreamed of nobility, found himself yearning once more for authority beyond what the Jedi allowed. These years as a Knight of the Republic were marked by triumph, wisdom, and renown, but also by the quiet growth of pride and disillusionment, the unhealed wound of a noble heir who had been told to forget his legacy but never truly could, and thus the Jedi Knight who served with brilliance was already carrying within him the seeds of the Count. The separatist and the Sith he would one day become. As the years of his knighthood unfolded, Count Dooku's reputation within the Jedi Order and across the Republic deepened into legend, for wherever he was dispatched, success seemed to follow, whether through the elegance of his blade or the sharpness of his tongue. And yet each triumph also widened the quiet gulf between him and the Council, whose guidance he still respected, but no longer revered without question. He was sent to worlds like Koru Nemoidia to resolve disputes between corporate trade guilds and oppressed workers, to frontier colonies plagued by pirate fleets, to core systems where noble houses schemed and rebelled against the Senate. And in every case, his presence commanded respect, his noble bearing convincing leaders to listen, his logic unraveling the webs of lies that others wove, and when diplomacy failed, his mastery of Makashi cut through enemies with surgical precision, always calm, always measured, as though even in battle he were conducting a dance rather than a slaughter. His missions forged bonds with beings across the galaxy, leaders who remembered his fairness, citizens who revered his courage. Yet behind closed doors, Dooku began to speak more openly of his frustrations, of senators who bowed to credits instead of conscience, of the Order's endless insistence on neutrality that left corruption unchallenged, of a galaxy that seemed to value greed over justice. Sifo Dyas remained his confidant, their late-night debates echoing with visions of how the Jedi might serve better if they were not shackled by the Senate's will. And while Sifo's thoughts often drifted toward prophecy and dark visions of coming wars, Dooku's mind fixed upon governance, law, and the need for decisive leadership. On missions where the Jedi were asked to protect corporate guilds from uprisings rather than address the grievances of the poor, Dooku's distaste deepened, and though he obeyed his assignments, he never forgot the faces of starving children, the hands of enslaved workers, the quiet cries for justice the Council deemed outside their mandate. And though his discipline and composure never faltered, within him the noble air of Serenno whispered that perhaps the Jedi had strayed too far from what they should be, that perhaps their devotion to peace had blinded them to injustice, that perhaps they had become servants of the Republic instead of guardians of the galaxy. Still, he taught where he could, guiding initiates in the temple with the same precision he demanded of himself, and many younglings admired him for his clarity and grace, though some also feared his sternness. For unlike Yoda's gentle encouragement or Thame's patient explanations, Dooku's lessons often carried an edge of demand, a sense that failure was unacceptable. The Council watched him with interest, some impressed by his brilliance, others unsettled by his independence. And though there were whispers that he might one day rise to sit among them, there were also quiet warnings that his pride might yet lead him astray. During these years, he undertook missions alongside Qui-Gon Jinn, the apprentice he would later take as his own, and even in those early encounters, Dooku admired the boy's independence and compassion, qualities that mirrored his own discontent, yet carried a humility he himself sometimes struggled to maintain. But for all the Order's praise, for all the Republic's gratitude, Dooku often returned from missions weary and disillusioned, asking himself whether his service was making a true difference or simply maintaining a corrupt system. And though he still believed in the ideals of the Jedi Code, he began to see the Order as rigid, stagnant, too comfortable in compromise. These doubts did not yet sever his loyalty, but they shadowed his every triumph, casting even his greatest victories in a light of futility. And though the galaxy saw him as one of the brightest stars of the Jedi, within he was already wrestling with questions that would one day draw him away from the Order entirely, setting him upon the path toward Count, toward Separatist, toward Sith. When at last Count Dooku was elevated to the rank of Jedi Master, it was only natural that he should take a Padawan of his own, and in that fateful choice, he selected the boy Qui-Gon Jinn, a decision that would shape not only their lives, but the fate of the galaxy itself. For in Qui-Gon, Dooku saw both a reflection of his own independence and a challenge to his deepest convictions, a student whose compassion and quiet defiance inspired admiration but also unease. From their first days together, it was clear that the bond between them would be profound, for Qui-Gon possessed a gentleness of spirit that complemented Dooku's stern precision, a humility that softened his master's sharp edges, and a courage that mirrored Dooku's own, but carried with it a willingness to follow the will of the Force, even when it contradicted the decrees of the Council. As their missions took them across countless systems, Dooku sought to instill in Qui-Gon the values he held dear: discipline in combat, mastery of Makashi's elegance, clarity in thought, and eloquence in diplomacy. And in these lessons, the apprentice flourished, becoming a formidable duelist and a negotiator of unusual wisdom for his age. But Qui-Gon also absorbed lessons Dooku had not intended, learning from his master's disillusionment with the Council, his skepticism toward the Senate, and his insistence that true justice often lay beyond the narrow confines of doctrine. Together they faced pirates in the Outer Rim, where Dooku's calm blade cut through chaos, and Qui-Gon learned that violence, though regrettable, was sometimes the only language aggressors understood. They mediated between noble houses on Alderaan, where Dooku's aristocratic bearing smoothed tempers, while Qui-Gon's compassion won hearts. They quelled uprisings on distant colonies, where Dooku's stern presence restored order, even as Qui-Gon questioned whether the Jedi were serving peace or enforcing oppression. Bearing smooth tempers, while Qui-Gon's compassion won hearts. They quelled uprisings on distant colonies, where Dooku's stern presence restored order, even as Qui-Gon questioned whether the Jedi were serving peace or enforcing oppression. His skepticism toward the Senate and his insistence that true justice often lay beyond the narrow confines of doctrine. Together they faced pirates in the Outer Rim, where Dooku's calm blade cut through chaos, and Qui-Gon learned that violence, though regrettable, was sometimes the only language aggressors understood. They mediated between noble houses on Alderaan, where Dooku's aristocratic bearing smoothed tempers, while Qui-Gon's compassion won hearts. They quelled uprisings on distant colonies, where Dooku's stern presence restored order, even as Qui-Gon questioned whether the Jedi were serving peace or enforcing oppression. In each of these missions, their bond deepened, for while they did not always agree, their respect for one another grew, and Dooku came to cherish in Qui-Gon the very qualities he himself had lost. The innocence of true compassion, the trust in the living force, the ability to see hope where Dooku saw only decay. Yet their differences also sowed tension, for Dooku often urged his apprentice to think beyond the Council's narrow rulings, to question authority, to trust in his own judgment, and though Qui-Gon absorbed this lesson well, he applied it in ways that sometimes frustrated his master, choosing paths of mercy where Dooku might have chosen order. Qui-Gon's refusal to bend unquestioningly to the Council, his defense of Anakin Skywalker, and his trust in the will of the living force all carried the imprint of the master who had shaped him, a master torn between nobility and disillusionment, light and shadow. In these years, Dooku was still admired as a Jedi Master of wisdom and power, and his bond with Qui-Gon was seen as a model of mentorship, yet within him the contradictions sharpened. Pride in his apprentice's growth mixed with unease at his defiance. Admiration for Qui-Gon's compassion mingled with envy for a purity Dooku no longer felt, and above all, a deepening conviction that he himself was meant to guide the galaxy, not merely serve it. Thus, the years of Dooku and Qui-Gon together were years of triumph and tension, years that produced one of the greatest Jedi of the age and one of the most tragic Sith of history. For even as the Master shaped the student reflected back to the Master the truth of what he might have been, had pride not steered him down another road, and in that reflection lay both love and sorrow, the quiet tragedy of a bond that could never save Dooku from himself. As the years of Qui-Gon's apprenticeship unfolded, the relationship between Master and Padawan grew into one of the most celebrated yet complex bonds in the Jedi Order. For while Dooku shaped Qui-Gon into a warrior of elegance and discipline, Qui-Gon in turn awakened in Dooku both admiration and unease, as their journeys across the galaxy revealed the differences in their hearts, even as they strengthened their respect for one another. Together they quelled uprisings on Ando Prime, where Dooku's stern commands kept negotiations precise, while Qui-Gon insisted on listening to the grievances of the rebels, earning the trust of those who had once spat at the Republic's name. And while Dooku praised his Padawan's diplomacy in public, in private he warned him that compassion unchecked could lead to weakness, though even then he admired the boy's courage in following his instincts. On missions to core worlds, where senators twisted truth into profit, Qui-Gon's innocence sometimes clashed with Dooku's seasoned cynicism, for the apprentice believed in the good still buried. Strengthened their respect for one another. Together they quelled uprisings on Ando Prime, where Dooku's stern commands kept negotiations precise, while Qui-Gon insisted on listening to the grievances of the rebels, earning the trust of those who had once spat at the Republic's name in the Republic, while his master had already begun to see rot that could not be washed away. And though they sparred in philosophy as often as in combat, their bond remained unbroken, each shaping the other in ways neither fully recognized. Was to guide him, and though this sometimes infuriated his master, who saw in it a lack of discipline, it also fascinated him. For Qui-Gon's connection to the living force was something Dooku himself had never achieved, and in quiet moments of meditation, he found himself envying the purity of that bond. They faced dangers that tested both. Marauders in the Outer Rim, whose fleets required both blade and diplomacy to defeat. Beasts on wild worlds where Qui-Gon's empathy for life taught his master a lesson he would not admit aloud. Noble courts where Dooku's aristocratic presence commanded respect, while Qui-Gon's gentleness won hearts, and again they emerged victorious, their strengths balancing one another in ways that few master and apprentice pairs achieved. Yet beneath the victories, tension brewed, for Dooku's disillusionment with the Council deepened with every mission where the Order seemed more interested in preserving the Republic's politics than in true justice. And though Qui-Gon was too young at first to notice, as he matured, he began to share his master's skepticism. Not in bitterness, but in independence. And this independence sometimes unsettled Dooku, who realized with a mix of pride and regret that he had encouraged his Padawan to think for himself, only to see him follow instincts that diverged from his own. When Qui-Gon showed mercy to enemies who would have betrayed them, Dooku admonished him for recklessness, yet deep down he knew this mercy was a strength he had long lost. When Qui-Gon refused to bend to rigid protocols, Dooku chastised him for disobedience. Yet in his heart, he admired the courage to defy authority in pursuit of truth. By the time Qui-Gon neared his trials, he had become not only a Jedi of extraordinary skill, but a man who embodied the very qualities that Dooku still longed for, but could no longer fully embrace. Compassion without naivety, strength without arrogance, independence without bitterness. And though the Council lauded Dooku for training such a remarkable apprentice, he often wondered in silence whether Qui-Gon had taught him more than he had taught the boy. Their parting when Qui-Gon became a knight was marked not by sentimentality but by quiet respect, master and student bowing to one another with unspoken understanding. And though their paths would diverge, their bond endured, a thread of love and conflict that bound them across the years, shaping decisions that would echo even into the rise of the Sith and the fall of the Republic. For in Qui-Gon's independence lived the echo of Dooku's teachings, and in Dooku's disillusionment lived the sorrow of a master who had glimpsed what he might have been had he walked the gentler path his apprentice chose. And thus the tale of their bond became both a triumph and a tragedy. The story of a master and apprentice who loved one another deeply, yet could not save one another from the choices that destiny demanded. When Dooku at last ascended to the rank of Jedi Master, it was a recognition not only of his mastery of the Force and the blade, but of his decades of service, his countless victories in diplomacy and combat, his reputation as a scholar and teacher, and his ability to command respect in every chamber he entered, and yet even as he accepted the honor with a dignity and poise that seemed his birthright, he carried into this new station the same doubts that had long whispered within him, doubts that would only sharpen in the years to come as he moved closer to the heart of the Order, the Jedi Council itself. For to sit among the council was to witness the deliberations of the greatest masters of the age, and at first Dooku listened with respect, learning from the wisdom of those who had guided the Order for generations. Yet as missions multiplied and crises mounted, he found himself increasingly at odds with their decisions, their tendency to compromise where he demanded clarity, their refusal to confront corruption head-on, their constant bowing to the authority of the Senate. Again and again he watched as the council deliberated endlessly, weighed every nuance, and issued decrees that sought balance rather than justice. And though he understood their reasoning, it gnawed at him that in striving for equilibrium, they allowed suffering to fester, that in trying to serve both the Force and the Republic, they became servants of neither. His missions as a master took him deeper into the galaxy's wounds, worlds where famine spread, while senators grew fat on bribes. Planets where mercenaries ruled because the Republic lacked will, colonies abandoned to piracy because the Senate deemed them unprofitable. And each time he returned to Coruscant, he carried not only reports of what he had seen, but outrage, urging the council to act with decisiveness, to shed the chains of politics, to use the power they possessed for the sake of true justice. Yoda. He found himself increasingly at odds with their decisions, their tendency to compromise where he demanded clarity, their refusal to confront corruption head-on, their constant bowing to the authority of the Senate. Again and again he watched as the council deliberated endlessly, weighed every nuance, and issued decrees that sought balance rather than justice. And though he understood their reasoning, it gnawed at him that in striving for equilibrium, they allowed suffering to fester, that in trying to serve both the Force and the Republic, they became servants of neither. His missions as a master took him deeper into the galaxy's wounds, worlds where famine spread, while senators grew fat on bribes. His tendency to stand apart, proud and certain even when outnumbered. This independence made him both invaluable and suspect, a voice that could not be ignored, but often unsettled the harmony of their deliberations. Outside the council chamber, Dooku was revered by younger Jedi as a model of mastery, a teacher whose precision in lightsaber combat and depth of Force knowledge inspired awe. But those who trained under him also felt the weight of his demands, the sharpness of his criticism, for he tolerated no mediocrity, no half measures, insisting always on excellence, on clarity, on conviction. Qui-Gon Jinn, now a knight in his own right, remained close to him, and though that they no longer shared the bond of master and apprentice, their discussions often circled back to the same questions. What was the role of a Jedi? Where did loyalty to the Council end? And what did it mean to follow the will of the Force when it contradicted the decrees of those who claimed to speak for it? These questions were no longer idle musings for Dooku, but the gnawing core of his discontent, the rift that widened with every council meeting, every Senate mandate, every mission where he was forced to uphold laws he believed unjust. Yet, for all his dissatisfaction, he remained a Jedi, still bound by oath, still respected peers, still serving with brilliance. And it was this paradox that defined his years as a master. The outward image of one of the greatest Jedi of his generation, the inward turmoil of a man who no longer believed in the institution he had sworn to serve, who saw more clearly than most its flaws, yet could not yet admit, even to himself, that his path was already leading him away from the light and toward a destiny that would forever mark him as a figure of both brilliance and tragedy. As Dooku's years as a Jedi Master unfolded, his stature within the Order grew until he stood as one of the most respected figures of his time, admired by students for his clarity of teaching, by peers for his elegance in combat and debate, and even by the Council itself for his wisdom, though beneath that admiration lingered unease. For he was a man whose loyalty to the Code was tempered by a relentless independence that made him both a jewel of the Order and a constant challenge to its harmony. He taught apprentices with a demanding hand, instilling in them the same discipline he demanded of himself, and while some crumbled under the sharpness of his expectations, others thrived, emerging as Jedi of remarkable strength and conviction. Yet even those who admired him whispered of the cold precision in his training, the way he brooked no weakness, no hesitation, no failure. In the council chambers, his voice was one that could not be ignored. Eloquent, commanding, steeped in knowledge of history and philosophy, yet too often unwilling to bend to consensus. For while others sought unity, Dooku sought clarity. And he did not hesitate to challenge decisions he deemed short-sighted or cowardly. Missions continued to take him across the galaxy, each one reinforcing his disillusionment with the Republic. Senators fattened on corruption, planetary disputes driven by greed, endless bureaucracy grinding justice into stalemate. And each time he returned, he pressed the Council to act more decisively, to recognize that their partnership with the Senate had compromised their ability to serve the Force. Yoda, ever patient, listened to his former students' passionate arguments, and though he counseled humility, he never silenced him, for he knew that in Dooku's voice there was both danger and truth, and he hoped that patience might yet temper the pride that threatened to consume him. But Dooku was not alone in his doubts. Sifo Dyas too shared his concerns, speaking of visions of war and the need for the Jedi to prepare for a darkness rising. And though the Council dismissed such fears, Dooku listened, for he too felt that the galaxy was drifting toward conflict, that the Republic was too corrupt to survive unshaken, and that the Jedi, as they were, could not prevent the storm. Among the younger Jedi, Dooku's reputation as a teacher and thinker only grew, and Qui-Gon Jinn, now a knight, often returned to debate with his former master, their conversations circling endlessly around the question of what it truly meant to serve the Force. Qui-Gon trusting in the living moment, Dooku pressing for vision and leadership, and though they disagreed, the bond of respect endured, bittersweet in its reminder of the paths they had each chosen. The Council, however, grew increasingly wary of Dooku's independence. Some admired his brilliance and saw in him a future Grand Master. Others whispered of his pride and feared that his certainty placed him too far above the harmony of the Order. Yet so long as he remained, his presence lent them gravitas, for he was a figure who commanded respect wherever he walked. Still, within Dooku himself, the rift deepened. Every session in the Council chamber where compromise triumphed over conviction, every mission where corruption was left unchallenged, every moment where his calls for reform were ignored, drew him further from the order he had once served so faithfully, until the image of the Jedi as serene guardians of peace seemed to him a hollow mask, behind which they had become little more than servants of a republic too broken to save. In this tension, his years as a Jedi Master became the crucible of his final transformation. Not yet the Count of Serenno, not yet the Sith Lord Darth Tyranus, but no longer truly the Jedi Knight he had once been. Instead, a man of brilliance and pride, standing at the edge of two worlds, respected by all yet belonging to none, already walking the path that would lead him away from the Council's circle and into the shadows where destiny waited with open arms. When Count Dooku returned to Serenno after decades of service to the Jedi, he did so not as a prodigal son, but as a weary master disillusioned with the Order and a man whose birthright had long haunted him. For though the Jedi had urged him to shed all attachment, the name of Serenno had never left him, lingering in the marrow of his bones, in the cadence of his speech, in the noble bearing that set him apart from every other Jedi. And when word came that his family had fallen into disgrace, his father Count Gora dead, and the estates of Serenno weakened by greed and incompetence, Dooku felt both the pull of heritage and the sting of responsibility, as though the land itself were calling him home. His return was met with suspicion by some and relief by others, for the people of Serenno, long oppressed by the corruption of noble houses, still remembered the boy taken by the Jedi, and in the tall, robed figure who now walked their halls, they saw not merely a Jedi Master, but the heir who might restore dignity to their world. Yet for Dooku, the return was no triumphant homecoming, but a confrontation with ghosts. The bitter memory of his father's rejection, the cold formality of his mother, the weight of an inheritance he had been told to renounce, yet could never fully escape. As he walked through the marble halls of the family castle, he felt the old conflict rise within him. The clash between Jedi and noble, servant and ruler, humility and pride. And though he told himself he had come only to settle affairs, to ensure stability for his people, in truth he felt the old blood stir, the ancient pride of Serenno, whispering that perhaps this was the destiny the Jedi had tried to deny him. The world he returned to was fractured, peasants resentful of aristocratic excess, noble houses vying for power. Serenno's influence in the Republic dwindled, and in the midst of this chaos, Dooku stepped forward, commanding respect by his very presence, his eloquence silencing courts, his authority restoring order, his vision inspiring both loyalty and fear. To the Jedi, his return was troubling, for it seemed he was reclaiming an identity he had long ago sworn to abandon. Yet Dooku defended his actions with the same calm certainty that marked all his choices, insisting that he sought only justice for his people, stability for a world torn by greed. But in truth, Serenno's fall became the crucible of his own transformation, for as he assumed the title of Count, he also allowed the noble pride that had always lived within him to blossom, no longer restrained by the vows of a servant, but emboldened by the authority of a ruler. And with that authority came a vision of a galaxy led not by the corruption of the Senate, nor the timid compromises of the Jedi, but by strong hands willing to act decisively, to cut away decay and restore order. The fall of Serenno was not merely the collapse of a noble house, but the birth of a new Count, who no longer believed that the Jedi could serve as true guardians, who no longer felt bound to a republic too diseased to save, and though he had not yet embraced the darkness that would claim him. The shadows had already gathered around him, whispering of power, destiny and the promise of remaking the galaxy according to his vision. Thus, the Jedi Master became the Count once more. And in that union of titles lay the fracture of his soul. Still a Jedi in name, still bound by the code in outward duty, but in truth already apart, already walking a road that diverged from the light, a road upon which Serenno itself became both inheritance and justification, the world through which he would begin to shape the fate not only of his people, but of the entire galaxy. The assumption of the title of Count did not bring Dooku peace, but rather set him upon a path of tension and contradiction. For though he still wore the robes of a Jedi Master and still bore the lightsaber of the Order, he now carried upon his shoulders the mantle of Serenno, ruling as noble heir to a world that had long suffered under the weight of aristocratic corruption. And in uniting these two identities, the Jedi Knight sworn to detachment and the Count bound to his people, he placed himself in a position no other Jedi dared to hold, straddling the line between guardian and ruler, servant and sovereign. At first, the people of Serenno welcomed him, seeing in his presence a savior who brought with him not only the wisdom of the Jedi, but the dignity of ancient blood. And Dooku, for his part, felt for the first time in years a sense of belonging, of purpose, as though his heritage and his training had finally converged. He restructured the noble houses, stripped corrupt lords of their power, enforced justice in courts where greed had once prevailed, and in these actions the people saw hope restored. Yet within the Jedi Council, suspicion deepened, for they feared that attachment had bound him, that power had corrupted his vision, and though Dooku defended himself with eloquence, insisting that he acted not for personal gain but for justice, the Council could not ignore the pride that colored his words, the authority with which he ruled. Missions grew more strained in these years, for whenever Dooku was called back to the wider Republic, he carried with him the bitterness of a ruler who had seen corruption firsthand, a noble who had wrestled with greed within his own house, and each time the Council asked him to submit to compromise, to defer to the Senate, he recoiled, certain now that such institutions could not be saved. Serenno thrived under his leadership, its economy stabilized, its people finding pride once more. And though many saw in him a just ruler, others whispered of tyranny, for Dooku's justice was swift, his punishment severe, his patience thin for those who defied his will. And while he believed he was serving the greater good, he had begun to blur the line between service and control, between guardianship and dominion. In private, he wrestled with the contradictions of his soul, meditating on the Jedi Code even as he signed decrees that bent it, telling himself that he sought only peace, yet knowing that peace achieved through command was not the same as the peace taught in the temple. Qui-Gon visited him during these years, and their conversations were laced with love and sorrow, for the apprentice saw in his master a man divided, a Jedi who still spoke of the Force, but who now bore the weight of titles and lands. And though Qui-Gon respected his mentor, he feared for the path he was treading. Dooku, in turn, looked upon his former student with both pride and regret, knowing that Qui-Gon's compassion was the very quality he had lost, the very quality he no longer trusted. The Jedi Council sent emissaries to remind him of his vows, to urge him to distance himself from political entanglements, but Dooku met them with formality and cold courtesy, unwilling to relinquish the role he had taken up, convinced that he alone could guide Serenno into a just age. In these years, the fracture between Jedi and Count became unbridgeable, and though he did not yet renounce the Order, He had already stepped beyond it in heart and mind. His loyalties split between the ideals of the Jedi and the authority of his heritage, until at last the balance tipped irrevocably. Serenno, under his command, rejected the Republic's authority, choosing independence, and Dooku, in standing with his people, stood openly against the very Republic the Jedi were sworn to serve. The fall of Serenno was not marked by fire and battle, but by this quiet severance, the moment when Count Dooku ceased to be merely a Jedi Master and became something more and something less, a man who carried both light and shadow within him, who sought justice yet walked the path of pride, who loved the Jedi yet no longer believed in them, and who in claiming Serenno's crown had taken the first irrevocable step toward the destiny that would end with the rise of Darth Tyranus. Among all the figures who shaped Count Dooku's life, none haunted him so deeply as his old friend Sifo Dyas, for theirs had been a bond formed in the innocence of the creche and tempered through the trials of knighthood. Yet it was also a bond marked by tragedy, for Sifo's gift, his visions of the future, was both a blessing and a curse that set him apart from the Order. And as the years wore on, Dooku found himself both drawn to and tormented by his friend's warnings. When Sifo spoke of the shadow of war gathering across the galaxy, of a darkness rising unseen, the Council dismissed him as troubled, claiming that his visions were clouded by fear. But Dooku listened, because in those visions he heard an echo of his own disillusionment, the same sense that the Republic was decaying, that the Jedi were unprepared, that catastrophe loomed on the horizon. They debated often in those years, Dooku insisting that the Council's deference to the Senate was weakness, Sifo warning that the Force itself was crying out of impending conflict. And though their perspectives differed, their fears overlapped, binding them together in the certainty that something was terribly wrong. Dooku came to see the Council's dismissal of Sifo not as a single mistake, but as proof of their blindness, their unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths, their preference for serenity even in the face of storm, and in defending his friend, he began to distance himself further from his peers, speaking more openly of the need for the Jedi to act boldly, to prepare for war, to free themselves from chains of politics. Yet as Sifo's visions grew darker, his health suffered, the strain of glimpsing futures too vast to bear, leaving him restless, weary, and fragile. And Dooku, though proud and austere, could not hide the sorrow he felt for a friend whose gift was slowly consuming him. It was Sifo Dyas who first spoke of desperate measures, of the need to create an army to defend the Republic when war came, a suggestion so radical that even Dooku recoiled. Yet part of him could not ignore the practicality of it, for he too had seen the weakness of the Senate, the corruption of leaders, the inability of the Republic to defend itself. When the Council dismissed Sifo's warnings again and again, Dooku's bitterness hardened into contempt, and though he tried to remain loyal, the sense that his friend was being sacrificed to the blindness of others gnawed at him until at last the rift between him and the Order became almost irreparable. The shadow of Sifo Dyas became the shadow of Dooku himself, both men burdened by visions of what was to come, both disillusioned by the Council's inaction, both isolated in their convictions, and though their paths would ultimately diverge, with Sifo consumed by his tragic foresight, and Dooku drawn into the grasp of Sidious, the tragedy of their friendship remained a wound in Dooku's soul, the memory of a boyhood companion whose warnings were ignored until it was too late, and whose lonely fate mirrored the loneliness that had always lived within the Count of Serenno. In the quiet of his chambers, Dooku would remember Sifo's voice, insistent, weary, filled with both fear and conviction. And though he would one day betray the ideals of the Jedi, he never forgot that it was Sifo Dyas who had first given voice to the truth he already sensed, that the Republic was dying, that war was inevitable, that the Jedi as they were could not survive what was to come, and that only those willing to break from tradition could hope to shape the galaxy in its darkest hour. Thus, in the shadow of Sifo Dyas, Dooku's fall was already being written, not by malice but by conviction, not by hunger for power alone, but by the tragedy of a man who believed his friend and refused to accept that the Jedi's blindness could ever be called wisdom. In the years that followed, the shadow of Sifo Dyas never left Dooku, for their friendship, forged in the fire of youth, became both a comfort and a wound, as Sifo's visions grew darker, more desperate, and more isolating. And Dooku, though prideful and austere, could not help but feel the weight of his companion's burden as though it were his own. Together they walked corridors of the temple in whispered conversation, Sifo's eyes clouded with dread as he spoke of armies rising, of stars consumed by war, of darkness coiling around the Republic. And though many dismissed these words as the anxious imaginings of a mind too open to the Force, Dooku listened. For he too felt the currents shifting, the galaxy trembling at the edges of something vast and terrible. Missions with Sifo became difficult, for his friend's foresight often overwhelmed him in the field, sudden collapses or visions striking at inopportune moments. Yet Dooku defended him against whispers of weakness, insisting that Sifo's gift was not a flaw, but a burden placed upon him by the Force itself. And yet, the more the Council ignored his warnings, the more bitter Dooku grew, his disdain for their serenity deepening into contempt. For what kind of wisdom, he asked himself, turns a blind eye to visions of disaster simply because they are inconvenient? When Sifo confided his belief that the Republic would one day need a great army, Dooku was shocked by the extremity of the idea. Yet in the recesses of his mind he found it difficult to dismiss entirely, for he had seen firsthand the impotence of the Senate, the inability of Jedi to enforce peace when shackled by politics, and though he never said so aloud, he began to consider that perhaps Sifo's radical solution was not madness, but foresight. Their bond, once one of laughter and camaraderie, grew strained under the weight of prophecy and pride, for Dooku's insistence on control often clashed with Sifo's frantic urgency, yet neither could abandon the other. Bound as they were by shared disillusionment and the loneliness of seeing what others refused to see. In council chambers, Dooku found himself defending Sifo again and again, growing sharper, more accusatory, as he watched the Masters dismiss his friend's visions as clouded or irrelevant. And with each dismissal, he drifted further from the Order's unity, aligning himself not with the calm wisdom of his peers, but with the fiery conviction of a man most of them pitied. This isolation mirrored his own inner fracture, for in Sifo's torment he saw his own doubts reflected, the sense that they were both voices crying into the void, unheard by those too blinded by tradition and complacency to act. When at last Sifo began secretive projects, speaking in hushed tones of measures that must be taken outside the Council's sight, Dooku felt the full measure of tragedy descend upon their bond. For though he recoiled at the dangerous ambition of it, he also understood, perhaps too well, why Sifo believed it necessary, and in that understanding he found no peace. Only the terrible recognition that the Jedi Order they had both served since childhood was already failing. Dooku's pride prevented him from admitting the depth of his sorrow, but in quiet moments he mourned the friend who had once been his brightest companion, now consumed by visions and dismissed by those who should have been his protectors. In the shadow of Sifo Dyas, Dooku's own doubts were sharpened into certainties: that the Council was blind, that the Republic was crumbling, that only bold action could save the galaxy from ruin. And though his path would diverge from his friends, leading him into the snare of Sidious, it was Sifo's lonely struggle that gave form to Dooku's disillusionment, the spark that lit the fire of pride and despair that would one day consume him. Thus, Sifo Dyas lived on not only in prophecy, but in the tragedy of Count Dooku, the friend who listened when others would not, the seer whose warnings became the foundation of betrayal, and the shadow whose presence haunted Dooku until the very end. When the moment of seduction came, it was not with fire or fury, but with whispers, as subtle and patient as the shadows themselves. For Darth Sidious did not approach Count Dooku as a stranger bearing promises of forbidden power, but as a confidant who seemed to understand the burdens that weighed upon him more deeply than any of his fellow Jedi. In hushed conversations, sometimes in the private halls of Coruscant, sometimes upon the soil of Serenno, where Dooku felt most himself, Sidious listened with sympathy as Dooku voiced his frustrations: the blindness of the Council, the corruption of the Senate, the tragedy of Sifo Dyas ignored and dismissed, and rather than refuting him as Yoda or Mace Windu might have done, Sidious encouraged him, affirming that his doubts were not weakness but clarity, that his pride was not arrogance but rightful insight, that his sense of destiny was not dangerous but essential for a galaxy on the brink of collapse. In these conversations, Sidious played the role of ally, not corrupter, weaving truths into lies so deftly that even Dooku, steeped in decades of discipline, did not at first perceive the trap closing around him. For what Sidious offered was not temptation in the crude sense of power for its own sake, but a vision of order, of justice, of a galaxy freed from the endless decay of politics and compromise. A galaxy ruled by wisdom and strength rather than greed and weakness. And though Dooku still recoiled at the word Sith, still saw in it the specter of fallen Jedi and centuries of destruction, he found himself drawn to the idea that perhaps the old dichotomy of light and dark was too simple, that perhaps what mattered was not allegiance to a creed, but the ability to bring true balance through a galaxy ruled by wisdom and strength rather than greed and weakness. And though Dooku still recoiled at the word Sith, still saw in it the specter of fallen Jedi through decisive action. Sidious spoke to his noble blood as well as his Jedi training, reminding him that he was not simply a servant of others, but a leader born of ancient heritage, that Serenno's people had looked to him and found hope, where before there had been despair and centuries of destruction. He found himself drawn to the idea that perhaps the old dichotomy of light and dark was too simple, that perhaps what mattered was not allegiance to a creed, but the ability to bring true balance. And was this not proof that he was meant for more than bowing before a council that feared his independence? He spoke too of Sifo Dyas, of how his visions of war had been through decisive action. Sidious spoke to his noble blood as well as his Jedi training, reminding him that he was not simply a servant of others, but a leader born of ancient heritage, that Serenno's people had looked to him and found hope, where before there had been despair. A galaxy ruled by wisdom and strength rather than greed and weakness. And though Dooku still recoiled at the word Sith, still saw in it the specter of fallen Jedi and centuries of destruction, he found himself drawn to the idea that perhaps the old dichotomy of light and dark was too simple, that perhaps what mattered was not allegiance to a creed, but the ability to bring true balance through decisive action. Sidious spoke to his noble blood as well as his Jedi training, reminding him that he was not simply a servant of others, but a leader born of ancient heritage, that Serenno's people had looked to him and found hope, where before there had been despair. And was this not proof that he was meant for more than bowing before a council that feared his independence? He spoke too of Sifo Dyas, of how his visions of war had required strength, that only through command could order be restored. Thus, the seduction of Count Dooku was not the fall of a man who sought selfish power, but the corruption of a noble heart convinced of its own clarity, a brilliant mind persuaded that the only way to save the galaxy was to abandon the very vows that had once defined him. And in the quiet surrender of conviction to shadow, the Jedi Master became something new, something dangerous, something tragic. The apprentice of Sidious, the future Darth Tyranus, who would carry with him into darkness not only pride and ambition, but the grief of Sifo Dyas, the disillusionment of Serenno, and the certainty that he had chosen not betrayal, but destiny. The path deeper into the embrace of Sidious was not taken in one moment of weakness, but in countless small concessions, each one cloaked in reason, each one defended by the conviction that he was not betraying the Jedi, but transcending them. For Dooku had always believed himself a man of clarity, a leader unswayed by base temptation, and so when he accepted the Sith Lord's counsel, he told himself it was not surrender, but alignment, not corruption, but a practical recognition that only through strength could the galaxy be saved. Sidious master manipulator that he was, nurtured this belief, never pressing too hard, never forcing the Count to confront the full weight of what he was becoming, but instead feeding him truths he already believed, that the Senate was rotted from within, that the Jedi Council had lost its vision, that the galaxy was sliding into chaos, and that Dooku himself was uniquely suited to restore order. At first, their conversations were wrapped in philosophy, Sidious quoting histories of fallen empires and the failures of the Republic, Dooku responding with his own knowledge of Jedi lore and the warnings of ancient prophecy, the two men circling one another in words until the line between teacher and student blurred, until the Count found himself looking to the Sith Lord not as an adversary, but as the only one who truly understood the magnitude of his doubts. It was Sidious who began to frame the dark side not as evil, but as power mischaracterized by the Jedi, a tool feared by those too timid to wield it, a force that offered not destruction, but the ability to shape destiny. And though Dooku recoiled at the idea, he found himself listening, weighing, imagining, and little by little the revulsion lessened, replaced by the dangerous curiosity of a man who had always sought forbidden truths. The rituals came slowly, meditations where Sidious guided him into deeper communion with his emotions, duels where the Count allowed himself to channel not serenity, but anger, contemplations where he permitted himself to embrace pride not as weakness, but as fuel. And in each of these steps, he told himself it was not corruption, but exploration, not fall, but freedom. He continued to walk the halls of the temple, continued to sit in the council chambers, continued to speak with Qui-Gon and Yoda, as though nothing had changed. Yet within him the shift was already irreversible, for where once he had seen compromise as weakness, now he saw it as betrayal. Where once he had viewed disillusionment as sorrow, now he held it as clarity. Where once he had suppressed pride, now he wielded it as proof of destiny. Serenno, too, became the laboratory of this transformation, for there he ruled with growing decisiveness, punishing corruption without hesitation, rewarding loyalty with swift favor. And though his people flourished under his leadership, whispers spread that their count had become colder, less patient, less merciful. And in those whispers Dooku heard not warnings, but vindication, proof that he had the strength to do what others would not. Sidious fed these instincts, whispering that compassion was weakness, that mercy prolonged suffering, that only decisive control could restore the galaxy. And though Dooku still told himself he was no Sith, still clung to the language of Jedi duty, the darkness was already tightening around him, binding him to a new master whose promises of destiny aligned perfectly with the Count's deepest desires. The final step came not with a vow of loyalty shouted aloud, but with a quiet acceptance of a new name, a mantle whispered into his ear in the dark. Darth Tyranus, apprentice of Sidious, a Sith Lord cloaked not in rage but in conviction, not in hunger for domination, but in the certainty that he alone could reshape a broken galaxy. And so the seduction of Dooku was complete, not through promises of pleasure or power, but through the careful twisting of his noblest ideals, the corruption of a man who believed himself too wise to be corrupted, who walked less merciful. And in those whispers Dooku heard not warnings, but vindication, proof that he had the strength to do what others would not. Sidious fed these instincts, whispering that compassion was weakness, that mercy prolonged suffering, that only decisive control could restore the galaxy. And though Dooku still told himself he was no Sith, still clung to the language of Jedi duty, the darkness was already tightening around him, binding him to a new master whose promises of destiny aligned perfectly with the Count's deepest desires. The final step came not with a vow of loyalty shouted aloud, but with a quiet acceptance of a new name, a mantle whispered into his ear in the dark. Darth Tyranus. Powerful guilds and corporate giants, uniting them under the banner of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, a name that cloaked the coming war in the language of freedom and sovereignty, while hiding the dark truth of Sith manipulation. Serenno became the seat of his authority, its noble courts now transformed into war councils, where Dooku met with leaders of commerce, industry, and planetary governments, persuading them with eloquence and gravitas that the Republic could no longer be trusted, that the Senate had become a marketplace of corruption, and that only by breaking free could their worlds prosper. With the charisma of a statesman and the bearing of a noble, he convinced the Trade Federation, the Techno-Union, the Banking Clan, the Commerce Guild, and countless others to throw their lot with him, each bringing fleets, droids, and resources that would form the backbone of a new order. His speeches carried across the stars, broadcast to systems tired of being ignored, his words striking chords of resentment in farmers taxed beyond survival, merchants stifled by bureaucracy, leaders suffocated under the endless corruption of the core. Yet behind the rhetoric of liberty lay the cold designs of war, for Sidious had charged his apprentice with one task above all: to prepare the galaxy for the conflict that would destroy the Jedi and transform the Republic into an empire. Dooku embraced this role with the same precision he had once applied to lightsaber forms and diplomacy, orchestrating alliances as though they were moves in a great game of Dejarik, each piece positioned to strengthen the Confederacy while weakening the Republic. He oversaw the mass production of battle droids, legions upon legions manufactured in hidden factories, a tide of steel that would one day march across 1,000 battlefields. He commissioned fleets, fortresses, and armaments, the scale of which dwarfed anything the Republic could muster without militarizing itself, and in doing so, he ensured that his master's long game would unfold precisely as intended. The Republic, unarmed and complacent, would be forced to raise its own army, an army that Sidious had already set into motion through the tragic foresight of Sifo Dyas and the secret manipulation of Kaminoan cloners. And yet, even as he worked toward his master's designs, Dooku believed himself to be acting of his own will, for he truly saw the Confederacy as the answer to the galaxy's rot, a chance to cast aside the decrepit Senate and the timid Jedi, to build a new order under his own guidance, and it was this conviction that made his seduction complete. He did not think of himself as a servant of darkness, but as a liberator, a visionary, even a savior. To those who followed him, he was not a Sith Lord, but a noble statesman, a Jedi who had broken free of chains, a Count who had reclaimed his world and now offered freedom to others. To Sidious, he was the perfect pawn. Charismatic enough to rally billions, powerful enough to duel the Jedi, and prideful enough to believe he was shaping destiny when in truth destiny was shaping him. Thus, the architect of the Separatists became the mask of Darth Tyranus, the public face of a movement that swept across the stars, drawing world after world into secession, until the Republic trembled on the brink of collapse, unaware that both sides of the coming war were orchestrated by the same hidden hand. Dooku relished the role, standing before cheering crowds, commanding armies, debating senators, and all the while believing that he was restoring justice, even as the shadow of Sidious grew darker around him, binding him ever closer to the fate of the Sith and the terrible war that would consume the galaxy. As the Confederacy of Independent Systems grew from an idea into a galactic reality, Dooku's role as its architect required him not only to rally systems with soaring rhetoric, but also to bind together an alliance of the most dangerous and self-serving factions the galaxy had ever known, each one powerful in resources yet fractured in loyalty. And it was here that his skills as a statesman and manipulator shone as brilliantly as his blade once had in the temple, for he balanced the greed of Nute Gunray and the Trade Federation against the ambition of Wat Tambor and the Techno-Union, the cunning of Poggle the Lesser and the Geonosian hives against the cold calculations of the banking clans San Hill. And in each case, he ensured that their rivalries fueled their productivity, rather than undermine their unity, promising them profits, power, or independence, all while concealing that their true purpose was to serve as pawns in a war designed not to win, but to bleed the galaxy dry. Serenno itself became the diplomatic heart of the Confederacy, but Geonosis became its forge, its factories birthing endless waves of battle droids, its arenas hosting secret councils where Dooku presided with authority, always calm, always dignified, giving the impression of noble leadership while hiding the iron grip of Darth Tyranus beneath. He played upon the fears of small worlds long ignored by the Senate, convincing them that secession was their only hope. while simultaneously stroking the ambitions of corporations that craved unfettered dominance. And though each thought they manipulated him for their gain, in truth it was Dooku who wove them into the great tapestry of Sidious's design. To his allies he spoke of freedom, to his followers he spoke of justice, but to himself he whispered of destiny, of the new order he believed he was shaping with his own hands, an order where the Jedi no longer shackled themselves to politicians, where corruption was crushed, where strength and clarity guided governance rather than endless compromise. Yet, to maintain this illusion of noble rebellion, Dooku also had to don the mask of warrior once more. For he could not simply sit in councils, but had to lead by example, appearing on battlefronts to inspire courage, dueling Jedi to prove the might of the Separatist cause, and in doing so, he became both symbol and general, the figure around whom billions rallied, even as they remained blind to the Sith shadow he carried. His manipulation of individuals was as precise as any Makashi strike. Newt Gunray, terrified of assassination after his failure at Naboo, was bound to Dooku by promises of protection and revenge. Wat Tambor was bribed with contracts that expanded Techno-Union influence across entire sectors. Poggle was ensnared by appeals to Geonosis's ancient pride, turning Hive loyalty into a factory of war. San Hill was promised unrivaled control of galactic finance once the Republic fell. Each pawn believed they were securing their place in the galaxy's future, yet all were blind to the truth that they were building the machinery of their own destruction. And still in the quiet of his chambers, Dooku told himself he was no mere puppet of Sidious, that he was guiding the Confederacy toward independence not merely for his master's schemes, but for his own vision, that when the war ended, it would be he, not Sidious, who stood as the galaxy's true architect of order. But such thoughts were the deepest layer of his tragedy, for though he believed himself a master of the game, every move he made only tightened the web of his master's design, ensuring that the war he so carefully built was nothing more than the crucible through which the Jedi would burn, and the Republic would be reborn as Empire. Yet, in the eyes of the galaxy, he was no Sith, no pawn, but the architect of the Separatists, the noble Count of Serenno, who had risen above corruption, who had defied a failing republic, who had inspired billions to secede, and who, with the dignity of a statesman and the cunning of a warrior, led them into the greatest conflict the galaxy had ever known. When the Clone Wars erupted in fire and chaos across the galaxy, Count Dooku, now Darth Tyranus in truth, if not in name, stood at the heart of the storm as both duelist and general, the living symbol of the Separatist cause and the embodiment of the Confederacy's will. For though fleets clashed across the stars and droid armies swarmed upon countless battlefields, it was Dooku himself who gave the movement its gravitas, its dignity, and its sense of inevitability. A man whose blade and words alike cut through resistance with the same precision. On the battlefield, he was no mere politician orchestrating war from afar, but a warrior whose mastery of Makashi, the elegant form of the lightsaber, made him nearly untouchable, his poise and control turning duels into dances of inevitability, where every flick of his curved hilt dismantled the attacks of even the most gifted Jedi. Time and again he entered combat, not because he needed to, for he could have commanded from the shadows, but because his presence on the front lines inspired his allies and demoralized his enemies. For the sight of the great Count of Serenno standing at the head of droid legions made the Separatist cause seem unshakable, while for the Jedi, it was a wound to the heart to see one of their most brilliant masters wielding his blade against them. Dooku's duels became legends of the war. The graceful counters that humbled Obi-Wan Kenobi on Geonosis, the ferocious duel on Naboo against Anakin Skywalker, where he displayed not only precision but raw cunning, the battle on Sullust, where his blade carved through clone commanders as though they were no more threatening than the droids he commanded. He carried himself not as a raging Sith, but as a composed aristocrat, calm and unhurried, even amid the frenzy of war. And this composure made him all the more terrifying, for his enemies could sense that every strike, every decision, every maneuver was calculated, inevitable, the hand of a master moving pieces across a board none of them could see. As a general, he was equally unmatched, his understanding of strategy rivaling his prowess with the blade. He orchestrated campaigns that stretched the Republic thin, forcing the Jedi to scatter across the galaxy, turning their strength into weakness as they tried to be everywhere at once, while he concentrated separatist forces with ruthless efficiency, striking where they were least prepared, retreating when it served his long game, sacrificing systems not for desperation, but for positioning, each defeat for the Confederacy feeding into a greater scheme. He forged the Confederacy's disparate leaders into instruments of war, not by inspiring loyalty, for they remained fractious and self-serving, but by manipulating their greed and fear so that their ambitions aligned with his strategy, ensuring that their fleets and droids moved in concert even when their politics did not. In this dual role as duelist and general, Dooku became the living paradox of the war, a man of elegance and vision commanding legions of machines, a noble who spoke of freedom while enslaving whole systems to his will, a Jedi-trained warrior now wielding the precision of the Force in service of the Sith. Yet, beneath the dignity and poise, there was weariness too, for the Clone Wars were never truly his war but Sidious's, and though he fought with brilliance and conviction, he knew in some part of his heart that he was a piece upon another's board, that the war he waged with such elegance was not meant to be won, but to consume the Jedi, to shatter the Republic, to bring about a new order in which even he might not stand at the center. Still, in the eyes of the galaxy, he was the Separatist's champion, the duelist no Jedi could match, the general no Republic strategist could outthink, and his legend grew with each passing battle, even as the shadow of betrayal drew ever closer, waiting for the moment when the master he served would decide that his time, like the war itself, had run its course. Count Dooku's legend, as both duelist and general, deepened as the Clone Wars raged on, for he was not merely the strategist who orchestrated campaigns from afar, but the very embodiment of Separatist strength, a warrior who could face Jedi Masters in single combat and emerge victorious, and a statesman whose voice carried across the galaxy to inspire secession and defiance against the Republic. His mastery of Makashi, the dueling form designed for elegance and precision, became infamous during the war, for with his curved hilt saber and unshakable composure, he dismantled the wild fury of Anakin Skywalker, the balanced strength of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the relentless speed of lesser Jedi with the grace of a master fencing champion rather than a berserker, turning combat into a demonstration of artistry, every strike a lesson in control, every parry a reminder that his decades of refinement could not be matched by youthful energy or brute force. Yet Dooku's reputation as a duelist was only half of his strength, for his command of grand strategy elevated him above mere warriors. He orchestrated campaigns like a master of Dejeric, using fleets, droid armies, and misdirection to scatter the Republic's forces, stretching the Jedi thin across 1,000 systems, forcing them to fight not as generals they were never trained to be, but as desperate commanders barely holding the line. He directed the Outer Rim sieges with precision, sacrificing systems strategically to lure Republic fleets into traps, using the Separatist war machine not to win outright, but to exhaust, to bleed, to spread chaos so vast that even victory felt like defeat for his enemies. To the galaxy at large, his dual image was carefully curated. Before Separatist leaders and the citizens of seceding worlds, he appeared as the noble Count of Serenno, eloquent and refined, promising freedom and justice against the corrupt Senate. On the battlefield, he was the Sith's shadow given form, his very presence demoralizing clones and Jedi alike, for they knew they faced not only a general, but a master whose blade carried decades of discipline, sharpened by the dark side's edge. He trained apprentices and assassins to serve his cause, from Asajj Ventress to Savage Opress, unleashing them as instruments of terror and trial. Their actions meant both to strengthen his position and to test the strength of the Jedi, while also cementing his role as the living standard-bearer of Sith power in the galaxy. Yet, for all his triumphs, his existence as duelist and general was a paradox. For though he carried himself as though the Confederacy were his creation, though he believed he was shaping the war to pave the way for his own vision of a just galaxy, he remained bound to Sidious's designs, a pawn convinced of his own mastery, a general whose brilliance prolonged the war yet ensured it could never truly be won, a duelist whose victories bought him time but also drew him closer to the inevitable confrontation with his master's chosen heir. Still, in these years of war, his legend reached its height. To his enemies, he was the traitor Jedi, fallen into darkness yet unassailable in his skill. To his followers, he was the noble liberator, the Count who fought for their independence. To Sidious, he was both weapon and placeholder, useful so long as his blade cut through Jedi ranks, doomed the moment he outlived his purpose. And so Dooku's role as duelist and general defined not only the course of the war, but the tragedy of his life. For in every elegant strike and every brilliant campaign, he served a cause he did not fully control. And though the galaxy saw him as a towering figure of power and vision, in truth, he was already ensnared in the final moves of a game where even the greatest duelist could not parry the hand of fate. As the Clone Wars stretched on and the galaxy bled under the weight of endless conflict, Count Dooku's role evolved beyond that of general and duelist into that of master and manipulator, a figure who shaped destinies as easily as he shaped battlefields. For in the shadows of his war councils and in the dark recesses of hidden citadels, he played the game of mentorship not with love or compassion, but with cold precision, grooming apprentices and pawns as tools in his long game, instruments to extend his reach, and mirrors through which he could test the strength of the Jedi and the pliability of the dark side. His most prominent creation was Asajj Ventress, the Dathomirian assassin whose rage and talent he cultivated with a cunning blend of encouragement and cruelty, training her in the arts of the Sith without ever granting her the title of apprentice, a half measure meant to empower her enough to serve his purposes, but never enough to challenge his supremacy. And through her, he unleashed terror across the galaxy, sending her to hunt Jedi, to destabilize campaigns, to spread fear and despair, all while whispering to her the same promises Sidious had once whispered to him, that she was destined for greatness, that her pain was her strength, that the Jedi were weak before her. Yet, when Sidious grew wary of Ventress's power, ordering her elimination, Dooku cast her aside without hesitation, a betrayal that revealed the cold truth of his tutelage, that for all his talk of destiny, he valued apprentices only as long as they served his ends. When Ventress's revenge nearly destroyed him, he turned to another pawn, savage Opress, twisting the brute strength of the Night Brother into a weapon of raw violence. A sledgehammer to Ventress's scalpel, and though he briefly found use in the warrior's savagery, he quickly learned that rage without discipline was as dangerous to master as to foe, and so Opress too was discarded when the experiment threatened to spiral beyond his control. In each of these apprentices, Dooku revealed both his brilliance and his flaw as a master. He could mold, he could command, he could inspire terror, but he could not love, could not nurture, could not create loyalty that endured beyond fear. And thus, his relationships were built not on devotion, but on domination, doomed to fracture when the weight of betrayal became too heavy to bear. Beyond his apprentices, when Ventress's revenge nearly destroyed him, he turned to another pawn, savage Opress, twisting the brute strength of the Night Brother into a weapon of raw violence, a sledgehammer to Ventress's scalpel. And though he briefly found use in the warrior's savagery, he quickly learned that rage without discipline was as dangerous to master as to foe, and so Opress too was discarded when the experiment threatened to spiral beyond his control. In each of these apprentices, Dooku revealed both his brilliance and his flaw as a master. He could mold, he could command, he could inspire terror, but he could not love, could not nurture, could not create loyalty that endured beyond fear. And thus, his relationships were built not on devotion, but on domination, doomed to fracture when the weight of betrayal became too heavy to bear. Beyond his apprentices, Dooku also manipulated allies and enemies with the same precision, bending the Separatist Council to his will through a mixture of promises and threats, playing the Republic's senators with half-truths and veiled threats, even whispering words to Jedi captives designed to sow doubt in their hearts, challenging their faith in the Council and in the war. To Anakin Skywalker in particular, he directed a special form of manipulation, recognizing in the fiery young knight both danger and opportunity, testing him in battle with taunts meant not merely to provoke but to reveal, seeing in his fury the same pride and clarity that had once led Dooku himself away from the Lord, ultimately served not his own destiny, but the dark design of his master. And though he believed himself the manipulator, in truth he was the manipulated. His brilliance chained to Sidious's vision, his apprentices doomed to betray or be betrayed, his mastery always incomplete, and his manipulation ultimately hollow. Thus, in the twilight of his life, Dooku stood as both master and manipulator, a figure whose reach extended into the lives of countless beings, shaping them in shadow, yet whose own fate was shaped by a hand he could never escape, making his legacy not one of triumph, but of tragedy, the tragedy of a man who mastered others yet never mastered himself. Yet Count Dooku's mastery of manipulation extended far beyond the narrow circles of apprentices and assassins, for he carried himself as though the entire galaxy were his classroom, and every being within it a potential student or pawn. His aristocratic bearing and refined intellect giving him a presence so commanding that he could bend conversation toward his ends without raising his voice, his words as sharp and deliberate as the thrusts of his Makashi blade. And in this role, he blurred the line between teacher and deceiver until the two became indistinguishable. With Asajj Ventress, he had demonstrated the cold cruelty of one who bestows strength only to take it away, teaching her to wield her fury until she became a terror to Jedi, then discarding her when she threatened to grow beyond his leash. Yet even this act of betrayal taught its own lesson, that the dark side offered power but not trust, mastery but not love, and Ventress carried that scar as deeply as any wound inflicted by a lightsaber. With savage oppress, his manipulation was even starker, molding brute force into a weapon he could unleash, but never trusting the Night Brother with subtlety, treating him as a living blade rather than a thinking apprentice. And in so doing, he revealed the disdain with which he regarded those he deemed beneath his refinement. For Dooku valued elegance, intellect, and discipline, and though he could wield raw power through others, he could not respect it. And thus, his students were destined to rebel or fail, their very impermanence reflecting the truth that Dooku did not wish to nurture equals, but to maintain instruments. Beyond the apprentices, his manipulation stretched into the tangled web of politics and war. For within the Separatist Council, he maintained order among men and women whose greed threatened to fracture their alliance daily, playing them against one another so that none grew too bold, and reminding them always that he alone, the Count of Serenno, was the arbiter of their collective power. To the galaxy, he presented himself as the noble liberator, addressing worlds eager to leave the Republic with rhetoric of independence and dignity, his speeches filled with righteous indignation at the corruption of Coruscant. Yet beneath the soaring words lay half-truths and omissions. For he knew well that the Confederacy was not a true democracy, but a machine of war controlled by Sith design, and still he convinced himself and others that the cause was just, that the sacrifices were necessary, that history would remember him not as a tyrant, but as a reformer who had dared to act when others clung to tradition. Even the Jedi were subject to his manipulation, for whenever he crossed blades with Obi-Wan Kenobi, he would speak between strikes of Sidious's control over the Senate, of the Order's blindness, planting seeds of doubt in a man known for his balance and loyalty. With Anakin Skywalker, he struck at pride and anger, taunting him, pushing him, recognizing in the boy's ferocity the same restless fire that had once burned in himself, and though he sought to weaken Anakin in combat, he also tested him, perhaps even admired him, as one might admire the heir to a throne one hoped to claim. To the Republic, he was the traitor Jedi, a manipulator who had abandoned his vows. To the Separatists, he was the master statesman, the noble leader who gave their grievances voice. To his apprentices, he was the teacher who offered power but never trust. And to himself, he was always more than any of these masks, convincing himself that he stood above the roles he played, that he was the true manipulator in a galaxy of pawns. Yet in truth, his tragedy was that for all his brilliance, all his elegance, all his mastery of manipulation, he remained ensnared in the greatest manipulation of all, the web spun by Sidious, who saw in Dooku not a partner or equal, but a stepping stone, a tool whose belief in his own mastery blinded him to the inevitability of his fall. Thus, Dooku's legacy as master and manipulator was as complex as it was tragic, for though he shaped countless lives, commanded armies, seduced worlds, and tested apprentices, he never realized that he was repeating the very cycle that had undone him, and that in the end, he had mastered everything but his own fate. The end of Count Dooku came not on some distant battlefield, nor in the grand halls of Serenno, but in the cold steel chamber of the Invisible Hand, where betrayal unfolded with the precision of a blade sliding between ribs. For after years of service to Sidious, after years of shaping the Separatist cause and waging a war that was never his to win, he was summoned to face the final trial that would expose the full depth of his master's deception. And he entered that chamber with the confidence of a statesman and the composure of a duelist, flanked by battle droids and assured that this confrontation with Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker would be another test. Another trial meant to strengthen his standing as the apprentice of the Sith. With elegance he met them, his curved saber igniting with its familiar crimson glow, and at first he fought as he always had, with poise, with control, dismantling Obi-Wan's measured defenses, turning aside Anakin's furious blows, the dance of Makashi flowing from him like second nature. Yet even as he parried, even as he pressed his advantage, he felt the pressure building, for Anakin's strikes grew heavier, faster, his raw strength pounding against the Count's precision like a hammer against a rapier. And though Dooku still believed himself the master, still believed he could break the boy's fury with a few choice taunts, he began to sense the truth, that this duel was unlike the ones before, that something within Anakin had changed. He struck Obi-Wan down, leaving the Jedi Master unconscious, and for a brief moment he smiled, believing the duel already won. But Sidious, seated nearby under the guise of Chancellor Palpatine, urged the young Skywalker on, his voice dripping with feigned helplessness, his words laced with dark encouragement, and Dooku realized with dawning horror that the duel was not meant as another test of his skill, but as the crucible of his replacement. Blow after blow crashed upon him, the boy's anger fueling his strength, until Dooku's precision faltered. Until the elegance of Makashi could no longer match the sheer momentum of Skywalker's wrath. And at last, his saber was wrenched from his grip, his hands severed in a flash of searing light, leaving him kneeling before his enemies, helpless, weaponless, and for the first time in decades truly afraid. He looked to Sidious, his master, his ally, the man who had whispered destiny into his ear, expecting mercy, expecting some acknowledgement of his years of service, but instead he heard the cold words that sealed his fate. Do it. In that moment, the world fell away, for Dooku understood everything, understood that the Confederacy had been a tool, that the war had been a stage, that he himself had been no more than a stepping stone, a necessary sacrifice to bring Anakin fully into the dark, and the clarity that had defined him all his life now cut like a dagger, for he saw too late the irony of his fate, that the master manipulator had been manipulated, that the noble Count had been reduced to nothing more than a pawn, discarded once his usefulness was ended. Terror filled him, but deeper than terror was betrayal. The realization that Sidious, whom he had served so faithfully, had never intended for him to rule, had never intended for him to be more than a mask, a symbol, a temporary apprentice destined to be cast aside. And in the silence between heartbeats, he thought of Serenno, of the boy taken from his home, of Sifo Dyas and his unheeded warnings, of Qui-Gon Jinn and the light of his lost student, of the pride that had carried him down this path, and of the legacy that would now be nothing but ashes. Anakin's blade flashed, and in a single strike, the head of Count Dooku fell, ending the life of the Jedi who had become a Sith, the noble who had become a traitor, the manipulator who had been betrayed, and his body slumped to the floor while Sidious smiled, already turning to his new apprentice, leaving behind the corpse of the man who had believed himself indispensable. Thus ended Count Dooku, not with the triumph he had envisioned, not with the destiny he had been promised, but with the cold inevitability of betrayal. His life a tragedy woven of pride, vision, and manipulation, undone at last by the very cycle of treachery he had embraced. And as his story closed in silence, the war he had built thundered on, leaving his name to echo not as savior or liberator, but as the fallen Count of Serenno, whose final lesson was that in the shadow of the Sith there is no loyalty, no trust, only betrayal. In those final, agonizing moments aboard the Invisible Hand, as the hum of lightsabers filled the chamber and the smoke of battle drifted in from outside, Count Dooku's mind raced faster than his failing body could endure, replaying the choices and illusions that had brought him to this place. For kneeling before Skywalker, thus ended Count Dooku, not with the triumph he had envisioned, not with the destiny he had been promised, but with the cold inevitability of betrayal. His life a tragedy woven of pride, vision, and manipulation, undone at last by the very cycle of treachery he had embraced. And as his story closed in silence, the war he had built thundered on, leaving his name to echo not as savior or liberator, but as the fallen Count of Serenno, whose final lesson was that in the shadow of the Sith there is no loyalty, no trust, only betrayal. In those final, agonizing moments aboard the Invisible Hand, as the hum of lightsabers filled the chamber and the smoke of battle drifted in from outside, above him, trembling with the weight of indecision, Dooku's eyes flicked to Sidious, desperate for reprieve, for recognition, for anything that might confirm that his years of loyalty had meant something. But in the Chancellor's cold, expectant gaze, he saw only calculation, only the same pitiless manipulation he had himself inflicted upon Ventress, Savage, and countless others. And for the first time he understood fully. He was not a master, not a visionary, not even a partner. He was a sacrifice, a tool, a stepping stone, whose death would cement the rise of the true chosen apprentice. Panic welled within him, an emotion he had long disdained as weakness, and he struggled to form words, to appeal to Anakin, to reveal Sidious's deception. But no sound came, for his dignity, his pride, his cultivated poise sealed his lips even in the face of doom. He thought of Serenno, of the noble line he had abandoned for the Jedi, of the aristocratic halls that had once felt too small for his ambition. He thought of Sifo Dyas, whose visions had been ignored, whose death had paved the way for the very army that now crushed the Confederacy. He thought of Qui-Gon, the student he had loved, whose death had perhaps been the first true fracture in his heart, the moment when his disillusionment hardened into contempt. He thought of the countless Jedi he had fought, each duel a twisted echo of the brotherhood he had once shared with them. All of it, he now saw, had been leading here, to this single instant where the truth of the Sith revealed itself in the clearest, cruelest form. There was no partnership, no loyalty, no destiny beyond the will of the Master. and when one apprentice outlived their usefulness, they were discarded for another. Anakin's face loomed above him, eyes burning with anger and confusion. And for a heartbeat, Dooku wondered if perhaps the boy would defy Sidious, if perhaps there was still some sliver of choice left to alter the fate of them all. But then the blade came down, swift and merciless. And in that final second, before darkness took him, Dooku felt not only pain, but an overwhelming rush of bitter clarity, the cruel recognition that everything he had built, the separatists, the war, the alliances, the apprentices, was ash in the wind, that his legacy would be not liberation but betrayal, not triumph but tragedy, and that in his end he was no different from the pawns he had discarded, his fate the ultimate reflection of the creed he had embraced. His head fell, his body slumped, and Sidious smiled, already turning his gaze toward the apprentice who would succeed him, leaving behind the broken remains of the man once called Count, once called Jedi, once called Tyrannus, now nothing more than a casualty of the great deception that was the Sith. In the end, what lingered after Count Dooku's fall was not his victories, nor his speeches, nor even the confederacy he had so carefully built, but the shadow of his choices stretching long across the galaxy like the twilight over Serenno. For though his head fell in silence aboard the invisible hand, the ripples of his life endured, woven into the fate of the Jedi, the Republic, and the Empire that rose upon their ashes. He had been born into nobility, raised in discipline, trained in wisdom, and yet his pride, his disillusionment, and his yearning for clarity had led him down a path that ended not in triumph, but in betrayal. And the irony was cruel, that a man who saw so much, who perceived the rot within the Republic, who recognized the blindness of the Jedi Council, had himself been blinded by his own certainty, ensnared by the very manipulations he believed he controlled. His shadow lay heavy upon the galaxy in the Clone Wars that raged long after his death, wars he had architected, wars that consumed Jedi and soldier alike,